Let's talk about the history of autism as a diagnosis. Hey folks, welcome to the Autistic Adoptee channel. As the channel name suggests, I am both autistic and I am an adoptee. As a disclaimer up front, I often have disclaimers up front in my videos, but as a disclaimer up front, I actually scripted this video. Generally, I try to work off of notes and run as unscripted as possible, but there's so much information to cover in this episode that I wanted to make sure that I got it right, or at least got it as right as I possibly can. So if it looks like I'm reading off of the screens in front of me, I actually am reading off the screens in front of me. Okay. In the United States and in many other countries, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM for short, is the standard diagnostic tool for diagnosing autism spectrum disorder and other, quote, mental disorders, end quote. And you can see a problem immediately just in the title of the manual alone, right? Labeling everything a mental disorder. Anyhow, in this episode, I'll be looking at the history of autism and how it came to be included in the DSM as a diagnosable condition or a diagnosable disorder. And I'll be looking at how understanding of autism has shifted since its inception up through today. Keep in mind that this is a very high level overview of a much deeper and much more involved topic. So there are two names that are most commonly associated with the modern understanding of autism. Those two names, those two people are Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger. And the fact is that these two, while receiving much of the credit, most of the credit, nearly all of the credit, are only a small piece of the history of the current autism diagnosis. Autism as we know it today is in large part because of Dr. Lorna Wing, who in 1981 argued that Leo Kanner's subjects and Hans Asperger's subjects were not displaying qualities of two separate conditions, but rather they were all a part of a much wider spectrum of people who shared various combinations of differences in social interaction. I call them differences in social interaction, but the current medical model calls them impairments in social interaction or deficits in social interaction. And it lists them individually as deficits in the criteria for autism in the DSM. An example being a deficit in comprehension and use of language, which is actually one of the criteria within the DSM for autism spectrum disorder. So Wing's 1981 paper, which was titled Asperger Syndrome, A Clinical Account, came a year after the diagnosis of infantile autism was first included in the DSM-3. Previously, many of the traits of autism were categorized under other disorders, primarily, though, they were categorized under childhood schizophrenia. In 1987, a few years later, the DSM-3R, meaning third version revised, that infantile autism diagnosis was changed to just be autism disorder. And then following that, in 1994, in the DSM-4, the fourth version, Asperger's syndrome was added as a diagnosis as well. It was not until the DSM-5 in 2013 that Asperger's syndrome and autism disorder were brought together as autism spectrum disorder, which matches what Wing had asserted 3 decades earlier. It's important to note that there has been documentation in medical literature of children who were likely autistic as early as the 1700s, and they were referenced or referred to as feral children. In the 1800s, there were asylums and training schools for, quote, intellectually disabled children who were likely autistic as well, and we have documentation of them from those schools and asylums. Basically, we have always been here. Autistic folks have always been here, long before vaccinations or any other supposed causes of autism came to be. We have always been here. So going even further back, there have always been stories of holy men or witches or holy women or just hermits in general, who could very well be described by today's understanding of autism. I mean, even that weird great uncle in the 50s who ate the same thing for lunch every day and had odd interests and awkward social interactions, he might very well have fit today's criteria for autism. We have always been here. Autistic folks have always been here. Anyhow, the word autism itself originated in 1910 with, and I'm going to give several names throughout this video, and I apologize if I get the names wrong. So, backing up, the word autism itself originates in 1910 with Eugen Bleuler, a Swiss psychiatrist who was building on the work of August Hoch, who had defined what he called the shut-in personality. He was also building on the work of Carl Jung, who had defined the introverted personality type. And it makes sense because all three of them, Jung, Bleuler, and Hoch, were all contemporaries, and they worked together at one point at the Bergolzi Mental Hospital in Zurich. Bleuler used the word autism or autistic to describe a symptom of childhood schizophrenia that he described as autistic, and this is a quote, as autistic withdrawal of the patient to his fantasies, against which any influence from the outside becomes an intolerable disturbance. To come up with the word autism, he combined the Greek word autos, meaning self, with the Greek suffix ismos, meaning a system, a theory, belief, practice, or condition, right? The anglicized form, the English form of autismus, is autism. And he used this term to mean a sort of morbid self-admiration and withdrawal within oneself. So along with other contemporaries, Bleuler began using the term schizoid to describe people whom they considered to have milder versions of schizophrenia. This milder schizoid version of schizophrenia he defined as and this is a quote, a shut-in, suspicious, incapable of discussion, people who are comfortably dull and at the same time sensitive, people who in a narrow manner pursue vague purposes and are improvers of the universe, etc. I'm not sure how being an improver of the universe is a bad thing or a disordered thing, but there you have it, right? Another early pioneer in autism research was Grunya Sukareva. Sukareva was a Russian Jewish child psychiatrist who worked in a clinic in Moscow where she worked with 11 children, 6 boys and 5 girls initially. Her practice extended far past that. but initially was working with 11 children, 6 boys, 5 girls. And although she initially described them as having schizoid psychopathy, she later adopted Bleuler's word autism and called it autistic psychopathy. So between 1925 and 1939, Sukareva published several papers, including in 1925 a paper called Schizoid Psychopathies in Children. And her description of the children that she was working with aligns incredibly well with the current criteria for autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5 TR. In 1927, she published a paper called The Peculiarities of Schizoid Psychopathies in Girls, which is very interesting considering that a very common misunderstanding that is only in the last decade or so really starting to be dispelled. A common misunderstanding is that autism is a boys condition, a boys only condition. And here she was in 1927 publishing a paper on girls with these traits. In 1930, she released a paper titled, this is a long title, On the Problem of the Structure and Dynamics of Children's Constitutional Psychopathy, Schizoid Form. Title aside, try to make sense of that, if you will, right? This paper discussed psychomotor disorders, disorders of affect and emotional responses, and issues with associative work and associative thinking. And then in 1932, she published a paper called On the Course of Schizophrenia in Childhood, in which she describes a lack of adaptability to life in the collective, a certain autism, and unreliability. So Sukareva, building on Bleuler's work, really was a groundbreaking pioneer in understanding these traits and documenting these traits that would become called autism, the modern diagnosis of autism. In 1925, her observations and descriptions of the children that she was working with, those observations and descriptions align almost perfectly with the current criteria for ASD, for autism spectrum disorder, that is in the current version of the DSM. As a clarifying note, you notice that the word psychopathy or psychopathies appeared in many of her titles. Sukareva was using the word psychopathy to simply mean a pathy, of the mind or psyche, a psychopathy, a pathology of the mind. The modern pop culture usage is in reference to like antisocial psychopaths, like in Hitchcock's Psycho. And this is actually very far removed from how the term has been used historically. So over the course of her life, Sukareva was absolutely prolific. She published over 150 books and papers, and the fact that her work went unheralded for so long, I mean, that's a crime that she was unknown, unheralded, considering how prolific of a writer and a researcher that she was. Some modern researchers actually consider Sukareva's work to be a more complete and detailed clinical description of autism than either Hans Asperger's work or Leo Kanner's subsequent papers on the topic. It's a shame that she went uncredited for so long. Another group of pioneers in autism research whose contributions went unacknowledged for far too long was the team of Annie Weiss, Georg Frankl, along with their colleague Sister Marie Victorine Zach. Weiss and Frankl would end up marrying later. So Weiss and Frankl were Austrian Jews who worked at the Vienna University's Children's Clinic alongside Sister Victorine, who was a child psychologist. Hans Asperger was also a colleague of theirs, and in fact, Hans Asperger finished his training under the mentorship of Georg Frankl before Frankl fled to the United States to escape the rise of Nazism and to marry Annie Weiss, who had fled a few years earlier. In the United States, Georg Frankl would go on to work with Leo Kanner. So while it was Weiss and Frankl who published papers regarding the team's work, it was Sister Victorine who was crucial in observing the children and developing many of the research and teaching methods that they used with the children. In fact, many of those methods she developed in collaboration with the children themselves. Sister Victorine was absolutely instrumental in conducting the studies and compiling the results. So Weiss and Frankl both wrote papers detailing case studies of what we now would call autistic children. Frankl published a paper in 1934, Weiss in 1935. Frankl's paper focused on distinguishing what he called word language, the language of words, in spoken form, from affective language. And affective language encompassed tone, body language, facial expressions, contextual cues, etc. And he noted that autistic children process affective language differently than non-autistic children. Weiss's paper in 1935 detailed the testing methods and what the tests revealed about the children, including their lack of affect, their social isolation, their need for routine, peculiarities in language and or intellect. Basically, between the two of them, they identified pretty much everything we understand now to be autism. Hans Asperger was, as I mentioned earlier, mentored by Georg Frankl when he arrived at the clinic fresh out of medical school in 1932. And then he worked closely with the trio of Weiss, Frankl, and Sister Victorine. And when Weiss and Frankl ended up fleeing to America to escape the Nazis, he continued working with Sister Victorine. And although Hans Asperger is the namesake for Asperger's syndrome, he is a very problematic figure in the history of autism, as well as just being a problematic person in general. Asperger's work, his published work, borrowed heavily from Weiss, Frankl, and Sister Victorine. Sister Victorine, as mentioned, developed many of the methods that they used in their study of the children. And Weiss and Frankl wrote many of the patient observation records that Asperger drew upon for his famous 1944 paper that is seen as foundational in the study of autism. Weiss and Frankl's papers on the same subjects predate Asperger's paper by a decade. Asperger's paper, in fact, included very lengthy passages that were taken directly from patient records that were written by Weiss and Frankl. The passages that were excerpted from Frankl and Weiss's writings included many of the foundational concepts that Asperger used to build his theory about autistic psychopathy. In his work, Hans Asperger neither cited nor acknowledged any of the work of Weiss, Frankl, or Sister Victorine. Asperger also leaned heavily on the work of Grunya Sukareva, who we discussed earlier. And even though Sukareva's work and papers were groundbreaking and align incredibly well with the current understanding of ASD, Asperger did not cite or acknowledge her either. But his notes contain many references to her and her work. Additionally, Hans Asperger is responsible for the view that autism is a boys-only condition. In spite of Sukareva and his other predecessors studying and writing about girls, Asperger wrote that there were no instances of Asperger's syndrome in girls. And remember that Sukareva wrote an entire paper detailing how autism manifested in girls. As a historical note, I cannot let it pass unmentioned that Hans Asperger actively participated in the Nazi child euthanasia program. He continually referred children to a clinic where children with congenital disabilities or illnesses were killed as part of a program of racial hygiene, so that the Nazis could ensure their genetically pure society. Moving on, Leo Kanner, like Asperger, also borrowed heavily from Sukareva, Weiss, Frankl, and Sister Victorine. Although born in Austria-Hungary, Leo Kanner emigrated to the United States in 1924, and eventually he became head of the Children's Psychiatric Service at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. Frankl would later join the staff of that clinic in 1937. In 1943, Kanner published a paper titled Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. So not only is affective contact directly in line with Frankl's 1934 paper, where he distinguished word language from affective language, but in Kanner's paper, he states, and this is a quote, "Since 1938, there have come to our attention a number of children whose condition differs so markedly and so uniquely from anything reported so far that each case merits, and I hope will eventually receive, a detailed consideration of its fascinating peculiarities." It's interesting to note that Frankl joined the staff in 1937 and was likely a key member of the team who identified those children to whom Kanner is referring. Also, in 1938, Frankl was drafting a paper titled Language and Affective Contact, which further advanced many of his groundbreaking ideas from his 1934 paper. As the head of the clinic, Leo Kanner would have certainly seen those early drafts of Frankl's paper on language and affective contact. And Leo Kanner actually discussed Frankl and his ideas by name in letters to a colleague that same year. So, like Hans Asperger, Leo Kanner did not credit Sukareva, even though he corresponded directly with her, and she had also sent him copies of several of her publications. He did not credit Sukareva, he did not credit Weiss, Frankl, nor Sister Victorine. And as a result, Asperger's and Kanner's work was considered the foundation for the understanding of autism when it was officially codified as a diagnosis in the DSM-3 in 1980. And it's also important to note here that Sukareva was still actively studying and writing about autism. And in the 1950s, her work on autism was focused on trying to disentangle autism from childhood schizophrenia. And childhood schizophrenia is, as mentioned earlier, the original diagnosis that many autistic traits were listed under in the DSM-1 and the DSM-2. So her work disentangling autism from this notion of childhood schizophrenia was decades ahead of its time, 30 years, 3 decades ahead of the actual autism diagnosis finally being separated out in the DSM-3. So the next major advancement in the understanding of autism came in 1977. And in 1977, Susan Folstein and Michael Rutter published a paper that found that there were distinct hereditary influences on autistic traits. Although Sukareva, Frankel, and Kanner, and others, considered autism to be a neurobiological condition, Asperger asserted that it was an environmental condition. And this view that it was caused by environmental factors, that was the prevailing thought up until 1977 when Folstein and Rutter published their paper. Autistic traits were often blamed on, quote, refrigerator mothers, end quote, who basically mothers who lacked the warmth to raise healthy children. This line of thinking was in fact used as a justification for removing autistic children from their mother's care up until 1977, when Folstein and Rutter's paper identifying the direct hereditary links in autistic traits finally ended that practice of removing children from refrigerator mothers. I find it interesting that even with that hereditary link being identified in 1977, there are still assertions today blaming autism on vaccines, inflammatory foods, fluoridated water, lead paint, etc., etc., etc. It's maddening, really. And this brings us back to where we started with Lorna Wing Dr. Lorna Wing in 1981. When she broadened the notion of autism into a spectrum that encompasses not only Kanner's disabled children, but also Asperger's savant type children, and a whole slew of variations in between. So, building on Dr. Wing's insight, Judy Singer, as part of an undergraduate honors thesis, coined the term neurodiversity. This concept of neurodiversity is a rejection of the deficit model that I talked about earlier. Instead of viewing autism as a collection of deficits or impairments, neurodiversity casts autism as a spectrum of traits that can be a liability. In some arenas, in some contexts, it can be a liability. And in others, it can be an actual asset. Neurodiversity, the term neurodiversity, does not carry the same stigma of disability, and it better explains the more complex and diverse nature of autism. Singer's thesis came in 2000. It was right on the heels of Asperger's syndrome being added to the DSM-4 in 1994. And 2000 is also the year that work on the DSM-5 began. And then in 2013, the DSM-5 was finally published, and it contained the current diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, which includes Lorna Wing's notion of a spectrum. It includes criteria for autism that closely aligns with Sukareva's descriptions as early as the 1920s. And it contains the combination of autism disorder and Asperger's syndrome under one umbrella. And other quote-unquote disorders were also pulled in underneath the autism spectrum disorder label. I still struggle with calling autism a disorder. I struggle with the deficiency model used to describe and diagnose autism. I I personally think that there is a great deal of distance to go in terms of simply acknowledging that people are simply different and that difference and diversity are healthy, positive things. When you approach difference with a little bit of understanding and acceptance, it is a healthy dialogue. It's a healthy, positive interaction. So anyhow, thank you for hanging out with me. I really appreciate you making it this far in the video. Let me know your thoughts and feelings about the deficiency model. Let me know your thoughts and feelings about the fact that so many other people contributed to the modern understanding of autism, and yet Kanner and Asperger still receive much of the credit. And let me know your thoughts about the fact that many of those early contributors were women who went uncredited. So anyways, leave any thoughts, comments, questions down below. And thanks a lot, folks. Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, remember to drop a like and leave a comment or a question down below. If you're new here, subscribe and ring the notification bell for more content like this. Until the next video, keep living your best life and know that you deserve it.